Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture on transmission view of culture and communication. This lecture is a part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will introduce you to the transmission view of culture and communication. The prototype of this view is Shannon and Weaver's mathematic model of communication that will be discussed in detail. The other model exemplifying the transmission model is George Gerbner's model. And finally, we will discuss Harold Lasswell's functions of communication, where cultural transmission is primary task of mass media. The reason for incorporating transmission view of communication in this lecture is to give you a comparative perspective of how the discourse in communication studies change when the emphasis is shifted from transmission and effects to culture and meaning making process. This lecture will equip you with a comparative perspective. You will be able to understand the paradigm shifts in the theory of communication when the focus is shifted from effects and transmission of information to culture. Without this, the various approaches to culture and communication will not make sense to you. Shannon and Weaver's model. The transmission view of communication characterize communication as a process of transmitting information. Initially, the studies on communication were dominated by this theme. The transmission model made its entry into communication theory through the work of Shannon and Weaver. Shannon's article, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, provides in detail the outline of this model. Shannon is regarded as the founder of information theory. Claude Elwood Shannon was an American mathematician and electric engineer, and Warren Weaver was an American scientist. The mathematical model of communication is an approach where human communication is analogized with machines such as telephone, telegraph, computer, etc. Their model is typically about communication through machines and how to make that communication effective without any noise or disturbance. Their information theory laid the groundwork for telecommunications and the computer industry. They both were working for the Bell Telephone Laboratories in the US during the Second World War. Shannon joined Bell Labs during the Second World War to find ways to break enemy codes. In fact, Bell Labs is known for many innovative scientific research that define the world today. Bell Labs' primary role was to support the research and development efforts of the country's then monopolistic telephone company, American Telephone and Telegraph, which was seeking to create and maintain a system. The word network wasn't yet common that could connect any person on the globe to any other at any time. This phrase, used to describe the era that the Bell scientists helped to create, the age of information, suggested we had left the material world behind. A new commodity, weightless, invisible, fleet as light itself, defined the times. Since they were working for Bell Labs, which is primarily serving to the American telephone and telegraph, Shannon and Weaver's primary aim was to develop the channels of communication that could be used most efficiently. And telephone cable and the radio wave were those channels that they wanted to work on. They produced a theory that enabled them to approach the problem of how to send a maximum amount of information along a given channel and how to measure the capacity of any one channel to carry information. This concentration on the channel and its capacity is appropriate to their engineering and mathematical background, but they claim that their theory is widely applicable over the whole question of human communication. Transmission view is about the frequency relations in electronic systems of telegraphy, radio, and telephony. Its applicability for human communication is full of doubts and has been criticized by further developments in communication theory. Transmission view is about the measurement of information. When we speak of the capacity of a system to transmit information, we imply some sort of quantitative measure of information. This model completely ignores the aspect of interpretation and transformation and focus on the capacity of the physical system to transmit information. Such transmission is independent of psychological factors of communication. In the design of a telephone system, the critical factor is the number of signals it can carry. What people actually say is irrelevant. This model may have its applicability for machines, but certainly not for human beings. Human beings are the thinking agents and possess the capability of transforming the world. This schematic diagram of a general communication system discussed in their paper has 5 main elements. Information source, that is the sender of the message, transmitter that converts message into electronic signals, a channel to which signals are adapted for transmission, a receiver which decodes the encoded message, and finally the destination where the message is received. In this model, the source is the decision maker deciding the message to be sent. The selected message is then transformed into signals by the transmitter, which is then transmitted through a channel to the receiver. So, for a telephone, the wire works as a channel, electric current is the signal, and the telephone handsets are the transmitter and receiver. In face-to-face conversation, mouth is the transmitter and sound waves are the signal which passes through the channel of air, and ear is the receiver. It is a linear model of communication. It is concerned with how senders and receivers encode and decode with how transmitters use the channels and media of communication. It is concerned with matters like efficiency and accuracy. It sees communication as a process by which one person affects the behavior or state of mind of another. If the effect is different from or smaller than that which was intended, this school tends to talk in terms of communication failure and to look to the stages in the process to find out where the failure occurred. American media theorist John Fiske, in his book Introduction to Communication Studies, argues that the problem of effectiveness in this model of communication seemed to imply that Shannon and Weaver regard communication as propaganda or manipulation. This means that the efficiency in the communication is identified when the desired response is expressed. Their model is primarily concerned with improving the accuracy and efficiency of the process of communication. Gerbner model. After Shannon and Weaver, it was American media theorist George Gerbner, known as the founder of cultivation theory, who has developed another model of communication. His cultivation theory is an extension of the model of communication that he developed. He studied the violence on television and how it shapes our perceptions. Gerbner's is like Shannon and Weaver's in that it claims to be universally applicable, explaining each and every act of communication. He is also known for studying the television content and how it affects viewers' perceptions of the world. According to Gerbner, people learn their cultural identity from a handful of conglomerates who have something to sell. Family and schools are not anymore the agencies of cultivation. He coined the phrase mean world syndrome, which means that those people who spend a large part of their time in watching television tend to believe that the world outside is unforgiving and a frightening place. According to him, fearful people are more dependent and can be easily controlled and manipulated. The deeper problem of the violence-laden television, according to Gerbner, is that people may even welcome repression to relieve their insecurities. Gerbner's model is considerably more complex than Shannon and Weaver's model. Although it followed the linear process model as its baseline, there are few advances. The main advance over their model is that it relates the message to the reality, enabling us to approach the question of perception and meaning. It sees communication as containing two dimensions of perceptual or receptive and means and control dimension. In this model, the process of communication begins with an event called E, which is then perceived by M, which can be a machine such as camera or a microphone. M can also be a human being. The way M perceives E is referred to as E1. This is the perceptual dimension of the communication process with which it starts. The perception is a complex process and involves selection. In the case of a machine like camera or microphone, the relationship between E and E1 is determined by its physical attributes and engineering. But if M is a human being, then the process of perception is not a simple reception of stimuli, but is a process of interaction or negotiation. In this process, human beings give meaning to match the external stimuli with the internal patterns of thought or concepts. Consider what happens if we fail to hear a word clearly or cannot decipher someone's handwriting. Or think of the visual puzzles of photographs of familiar objects taken from unfamiliar angles or in unfamiliar close-up. Once the matching or recognition has occurred, the photograph is easily perceived for what it is. Until this moment, we are in a state of frustration, for although we can see the tones and shapes of the photograph, we cannot say we perceive it yet, for perception always involves the drive to understand and organize. Failing to see meaning in what we perceive puts us into a state of disorientation. This matching is controlled by our culture, in that our internal concepts or patterns of thought have developed as a result of our cultural experience. This means that people of different cultures will perceive reality differently. Perception then is not just a psychological process within the individual, it is also a matter of culture. Now the next stage in this model in the horizontal direction is when the percept E1 is converted into a signal E, that is SE. S represents the signal or the form, whereas E represents the content. The content E can be communicated in different ways, meaning by there are a number of potential S to choose from. So the model focuses on finding the compatibility of S and E, which means finding the best S for E. So the relationship between S and E is the crucial concern of the communicator and is a dynamic and interactive relationship. Content is not simply conveyed by form. Shannon and Weaver's model implies that there is a core message that exists independently. It is then encoded, that is, it is wrapped up in language like a parcel for transmission. The receiver decodes it or unwraps the packaging and reveals the core message. The fallacy for him is the idea that a message can exist before it is articulated or encoded. Articulation is a creative process. Before it, there exists only the drive, the need to articulate, not a pre-existing idea or content that then has to be encoded. In other words, there is no content before form, and the attempt to find a difference between form and content is in itself a very doubtful exercise. In this vertical or communicating dimension, selection is as important as it is in the horizontal. First, there is the selection of the means, the medium and the channel of communication. Then there is selection from within the percept E1. Just as E1 can never be a complete and comprehensive response to E, so too a signal about E1 can never in its turn attain completeness or comprehensiveness. Selection and distortion must occur. Compared to Shannon and Weaver's model, Gerbner's model is advanced and imaginative. It also defines communication in terms of transmission of messages, but also tries to go beyond the process itself and addresses the issues of meaning to a certain extent. Fiske, who belongs to the semiotic school, argues that Gerbner assumed that perception of a message is same as our perception of an event. For Fiske, individuals do not respond to violence on television in the same manner as they will to a real life violence. A message is structured or encoded in a way that a raw event is not, and thus it directs our response more actively. By way of this criticism, Fiske addressed the issue of ideology. Function of communication, transmission of social inheritance. American political scientist Harold Lasswell has outlined 3 functions of communication in his essay, Structure and Function of Communication. The 3 functions that he defined are: firstly, the surveillance of the environment; secondly, the correlation of the parts of society in responding to the environment; and thirdly, the transmission of the social heritage from one generation to the next. We will now discuss in detail the third function as it reflects Lasswell's ideas on the relationship between culture and communication. Lasswell proposes a functionalist theory, which means that he outlines the role played by communication in the maintenance of the social order of society. For the maintenance of the harmony in any society, it is essential that the individuals abide by the prescribed norms and values. And to ensure the obedience on the part of the individuals, there are various socializing agencies that inculcate values in the individual. Communication also plays that role of socialization. In the above mentioned essay, that educators in family and social school transmit the social inheritance. So, home and school are the specialized agencies through which the values are communicated to the new generation. In this background, the modern means of communication are seen as injecting ideas into the minds of the passive individuals who just react to stimuli by following the desired goal. Here, the transmission of values is a one-way process. The individual is seen as mechanically internalizing the propaganda offered in the process of communication. The function of transmission of socio-cultural heritage cannot be seen in isolation. It is linked with the other 2 functions of communication, since the efficiency of communication is measured in terms of its role in creating adaptation among the members of society. There has to be some mechanism to avoid any violations and deviance. For that, the first function, that is surveillance of the environment, will play the role of surveying the conditions that can generate conflicting situations. So, diplomats and foreign correspondents will perform this function. Then comes the second function, that is the correlation of the parts to the environment. Journalists and editors are people who will play this role of integrating the parts, that is individuals, to the environment, that is the society. So, all three functions are interlinked in ensuring integration of the whole system. Going by these ideas, Lasswell conducted a study of Hitler's speeches in his book Propaganda Technique in the World War. The definition of propaganda exemplifies his transmission view of culture and communication. According to him, it refers solely to the control of opinion by significant symbols, or to speak more concretely and less accurately by stories, rumors, reports, pictures and other forms of social communication. Propaganda is concerned with the management of opinions and attitudes by the direct manipulation of social suggestion. In another book, The Comparative Study of Symbols, an introduction, he extends his arguments on the transmission of social inheritance by education institutions by saying that a vast amount of informal education is carried on outside the curriculum of the school. Newspapers are one such medium through which various symbols are transmitted. While the ideas propounded by Lasswell may hold true to an extent, but it does not qualify an uncritical acceptance. The analysis of culture and communication forecloses any possibility of collective actions to negotiate with or reject the dominant ideology. The individuals appear only as atoms in his scheme. Summing up this lecture, we hope that you have understood the significance of the theories that emphasized on cultural aspects of communication, where humans do not appear just as machines but possess an agency to resist and transform, thereby making their own history. In this lecture, we discussed Shannon and Weaver's model, which is a prototype of the transmission model. Then we explained Gerbner's model that addresses the question of perception, meaning and culture, but without addressing the question of ideology. Finally, we discussed Lasswell's understanding on the function of communication in terms of transmission of culture. There are various other models studying the communication process within this framework of transmission. We have discussed these selected models just to give you an idea of how transmission model was theorized. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. For more details, please read the e-text of this lecture properly and attempt the questions in the end. Thank you.